The first focus of this online lecture is first and foremost on learning. This course does place a strong emphasis on digital technologies, or ICT, information and communications technologies, but at its heart, it's about how we can harness these devices and applications and focus on learning. But I want to throw open to you today this idea of meaningful learning. Educators often use the terms meaningful and authentic when talking about the experiences that we design for our students. In fact, that statement I just made, the experiences that we design for our students, is loaded with quite specific terms that say a lot about my own philosophy about teaching and learning. It's interesting that the language that we choose to describe what we do reflects a lot about what we think. When I say meaningful, I'm going to talk about that a lot in just a moment. But I also use the term experiences rather than activities. And I use the word design rather than plan. If I said planning activities, to me, this has the connotation of slightly superficial, a slight sense of superficiality, as if the starting point is the activity. If I use the term designing experiences, on the other hand, I think it's more suggestive of a holistic process. Who am I designing it for? Suggests that I'm taking into account the needs of the learner. Experiences rather than activities. Our activities are things that you do, whereas experiences has that implication of being immersed in something, of something that you have, that is perhaps less transitory than something that you simply do. Anyway, I digress. An interesting digression. So back to that question, what do educators mean when they talk about meaningful or even sometimes powerful learning? David Jonasson is one of the early thought leaders in the digital technologies landscape, going back quite some time. But his work has withstood the tyranny of time, and he was one of the first people who got over the bells and whistles of technology and tried to draw really strong linkages between digital technologies and learning. And he describes meaningful learning as having 5 core characteristics. The learning is active. It involves the construction of meaning on the part of the learner. It is intentional. It is situated in authentic contexts. And it involves cooperation. I'm going to deal with each of these characteristics in turn. Jonasson draws heavily on the ideas of John Dewey and Jerome Bruner around the active notion of learning, that the learner is actively involved where they are experiencing, not just receiving information. It's a participatory approach to learning rather than a passive approach, where the learner can manipulate either objects or the parameters of their learning environment and observe what happens. So it involves experimentation and actively participating in the learning process. We construct meaning as a result of new experiences, either an active experience or being exposed to new ideas. And these new experiences and ideas often provide a discrepancy between what we observe and what we understand, that dissonance. This is where meaningful learning begins, where we're curious about or puzzled by what we see because it doesn't match what we think and understand. Being puzzled becomes a catalyst for learning. By reflecting on our puzzlement, we begin to integrate these new experiences with our prior knowledge, and we start to make sense of it. We construct new mental models to explain what we've observed or what we've experienced. Meaningful learning has this element of construction about it. Learning needs to be intentional. When learners are actively and willfully trying to achieve a cognitive goal, they think and learn more because they're fulfilling an intention. Meaningful learning should also have a high degree of authenticity about it. Learning tasks that are situated in some meaningful real-world task or a simulated task or in a problem or challenge-based learning environment are better understood and remembered. And, importantly, they're more consistently transferred to new situations. And that, dear people, is the definition of something that we have learnt, when we can transfer that meaning that we've made to a different situation. Learning experiences, as far as possible, should be embedded in real life and useful contexts so that the learner understands the relevance of what they're doing. Too often in schools, we decontextualise the learning task from the real world. And we often hear about learners who say, I don't understand why I'm doing this. What relevance does this have to my life or to my future life? Make the learning authentic. Meaningful learning also involves a degree of cooperation. It's collaborative and cooperative. It's argued by Jonathan that human beings naturally work together. We seek each other out to solve problems and perform tasks, much like the ants in this image are seeking each other out and cooperating to achieve the task of gathering the nectar from this flower bud. But in schools and at university, we often insist that learners work independently so much of the time. Is this just because it's easier to assess them individually? When we learn collaboratively, we learn about multiple ways of viewing the world and we develop multiple solutions to the problems. So, if these are the 5 key elements of meaningful learning, what has this got to do with digital technologies? In the next slide, I want to start to unpack the affordances of digital technologies that help support these 5 characteristics of meaningful learning. In this model, I call it the 6C model that I've generated, I want to identify 6 generic affordances of digital technologies that support student learning. I'm going to start with collecting, just over here. When digital technologies used to be called information and communications technologies, in fact, before that it was called IT, information technologies. And initially there was an awful lot of emphasis on using technology as a way to gather information. We had this brand new thing called the internet, which we've still got. A seemingly limitless source of information about anything that you would like to know. One of the most common uses of digital technologies in the classroom is, of course, to Google things. And I love that Googling is now a verb, and I do it every day, as probably do most of you. The interesting thing, though, about the internet in the early part of the 21st century is its multimodality. Information can be sourced not just in printed word, but in a range of modes, in sound, in text, oral, moving image, still image, animations, etc. So collecting information is easier than it has ever been before, thanks to the power of digital technologies. It's also possible to collect your own information via the internet. There are a range of online data collection tools that put the power of the researcher in the hands of individuals. So rather than just thinking about collecting information as passively taking on board somebody else's information, we can use the internet to collect our own information. Let's move to the next little box over here. With all of this information, we now need to do something with it. There is so much information from so many different sources that we can collect via the internet. There's now a range of online tools that we can use to curate that information. And by curation, we mean evaluating and organising that information, connecting the information that we've gathered to our own information needs or to the needs of our particular target audience. One of the applications that I love at the moment is something called Storify, which I'm hoping in one of the classes at least, one group will examine for us and show the rest of us how it can work and how it can help a student to critically evaluate and organise the information that they collect from multiple sources on the internet. And when I talk about collecting information from the internet, it's not just from flat web pages, but from social media sites as well, and from other information repositories and data repositories on the internet. I'm going to jump around these boxes and not do them in any particular linear order, because that's a characteristic of digital technologies, that they support a non-linear approach to thinking and creating. But let's have a think about this constructing section, this characteristic, this affordance. Digital technologies allow us to experiment without fear of failure, to enter into simulated worlds, to experiment with cause and effect. In a variety of digital technologies applications, we can simulate the real world, or even if we're not simulating, they foster a sense of experimentation and investigation, of exploration. And it's through exploring and investigating and seeing what might happen if I change this, or if I shift that, or why did it not work quite the way I thought it would? How can I debug what I've done to make it work? And it's through that problem solving around experimenting with digital technologies that we can construct meaning. This links directly back to one of the characteristics of meaningful learning that Jonathan put forward and that I explained in an earlier slide. Let's take a look at the creating hexagon. The texts that we all consume in everyday life, the way that we get our information, these texts are increasingly multi. They come to us in different modes. There are visual modes of communication that dominate how we receive information. These multimodal texts via websites, TVs, online newspapers combine the visual, the oral, the print, the video, the film. They're often non-linear. They're different combinations of texts that borrow from one another, and there might be texts that come from different social and cultural groups. It's really complex. Information is no longer just in the printed word. We don't privilege it to the extent that we used to. So there are new literacies that we need to develop in order to read these multimodal texts. And these literacies are complex. But in today's world, and for our students, it's not just about developing the literacies to consume these texts, it's also about creating these sorts of texts. Digital technologies allow us to explore how these sorts of products are created. And in the process of exploring and creating for ourselves, we improve our understanding of those literacies that we need to make meaning from these new texts. This has strong implications for the choice of digital technologies that you use in the classroom, and is at the core of my stated preference for open-ended applications that allow our students to develop these sorts of literacies that are non-linear and multimodal, that are open-ended and content-free rather than closed and content-heavy. Putting our students in the role of creators and not just consumers empowers our students. It allows them to be in control of the production process and gives them a sense of agency as they represent what they know and what they feel. By providing tools that do not privilege the printed text, we offer our students different ways of self-expression, different ways of revealing to us that even if reading and writing may be a struggle for them, they still know stuff and they still have ideas that are worth sharing. And that this links into the final hexagon in our model, that the ability to convey what a student knows or understands or feels is empowering. It is emancipating. All too often, students who might struggle with reading and writing are labelled, often inappropriately, and assumptions might be made about their lack of knowledge and their lack of understanding and their lack of ability to learn. There are so many times when I have put the power of a digital device into the hands of such a student and seen them flourish, just because I've given them an alternative way of representing what they know and what they understand, and a way of them being able to share that knowledge beyond just the student-teacher partnership. The idea of being able to share your knowledge and your understanding with a much wider audience is also empowering and also somewhat motivating. Students do their best work when they know someone else is looking, particularly when that someone else is important to them or potentially important to them, and more important than perhaps you are as their teacher. The final C is the connecting C, and this is the focus of our next online lecture. So I'm going to leave it at that for now.